The US has a debt problem. On March 17, 2026, our economy hit a record $39 trillion of debt.
The Bureau of Economic Analysis also shows that because in the last GDP report, the amount we're spending on the debt, if you annualize that, sure enough, it's also over $1 trillion.
And for the first time, the interest payments alone are making up the largest expense of the federal budget, bigger than the military, infrastructure, and education combined. On May 15, 2026, Jerome Powell stepped down as the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and Kevin Warsh stepped in, and he has a plan to fix the debt problem. A gamble that hinges on a theory that the world has not seen since the World War II. This is the story of Financial Repression 2.0. During the last 3 years of World War II, the US victories caused one of the greatest bull markets ever witnessed. The stock market grew roughly by 17.5% annually, thanks to the military spending. But during the same time, our national debt went from $43 billion to roughly $269 billion, causing a debt to GDP ratio of 106%. But we chose not to pay it off. Instead, we repressed it. The government and the Fed worked together to force interest rates below inflation. They effectively forced banks and pension funds to hold government bonds that lost value in real terms, also called war bonds. And the government got to borrow for nearly free. And inflation wiped out the real value of debt, and economy grew faster than borrowing. However, during the 40s, the real losers were the people at the bottom of the K-curve, aka the savers. This was Financial Repression 1.0. But here's the kicker. The Federal Reserve wants to do something very similar in 2026. However, a financial repression might not work this time. Well, for starters, in the 40s, the US market was flooded with the long-term fixed-rate loans, also called treasury bonds.
Job of each one of us, the greatest production of which we are capable, faithful adherence to regulations that make it possible to supply our men in battle with everything they need, and buying and holding war bonds.
However, in 2026, the 1 to 2 year Treasury bill and notes make about 72% of the total treasuries issued. The Treasury deliberately issued more T-bills in 2024 to 2026 because the short-term rates were expected to eventually drop. They didn't want to lock in at high 4 to 5% rates for 30 years if they believed that they could refinance at 3% later. Today, our debt is like an adjustable mortgage rate on a $39 trillion loan. So what exactly is Kevin Warsh's strategy? Well, first, he wants to drop rates by 1% to lower the cost of ARM-style debt. Unlike the passive roll-off we have now, Warsh wants to aggressively sell bonds back to the private market. He believes that by normalizing the yield curve and proving that the Fed is really serious, he can crush inflation expectations. If investors believe that inflation is dead, they'll demand lower yields, naturally pulling the interest rates down. But here's the risk to this strategy. If the Federal Reserves start aggressively selling billions in bonds while the US government simultaneously floods the market with trillions in new treasury debt, we may face a supply shock. At best, the private demand will soak up the supply, but in the worst case, if the private buyers shy away, the long-term yields will spike up. This creates a volatility trap. As the 10-year treasury yield, the benchmark for the entire global economy, spikes, it drags mortgage, auto, and corporate debt rates along with it. This has the potential to crush the housing market and trigger a corporate debt crisis, effectively forcing the US into a recession at the very moment the Fed is trying to normalize the economy. Secondly, Kevin Warsh thinks that AI will increase output enough to lower the cost of goods, creating an anti-inflation. He wants to cut rates without causing a spike in inflation, and he's betting on AI to do this. Warsh is betting that AI will act as a productivity savior, lowering the cost of goods to offset the inflationary pressure of this debt management. However, with only 20% of companies seeing any measurable AI productivity gains, this is a speculative bet on a massive scale. If that productivity surge does not materialize, we will be left with high debt and extreme volatility, potentially creating a bubble even larger than anything what we saw in the 1940s. This leaves us with a K-shaped reality. Whether Warsh succeeds or fails, the goal of this policy is to manage debt burden through inflation, which acts as a silent tax. It bails out the government and inflates the value of hard assets, while eroding the purchasing power of those holding cash. So if you're holding cash, you're holding the tax that funds this experiment. If you're holding assets, you are the part of the hedge. But what happens if the hedge itself is a part of the system? What if the very assets we trust, the stocks, the real estate, all are being rigged to move in a lockstep? Well, there's one asset that does not follow the Federal Reserve's rules, and it is the only one that has survived every monetary collapse in the last 5,000 years. I'm talking about gold.